Deadlifting, whether it be, say, a Romanian deadlift or a conventional deadlift, is categorized as a hip extension exercise because mechanically that's what the key focus of the exercise is to extend one's hips. Now, what often happens when performing a deadlift, whether Romanian deadlift or conventional deadlift, among others, is that we end up loading the back too much. So the movement becomes more of a back extension rather than hip extension. So if we look at myself side on, both back extension, which is sort of lifting the back up into a standing position, or hip extension, bringing the hips forward like so, is one and the same. When you perform hip extension or back extension, both happen at the same time. Now the difference being is the intention behind the action. What I mean by that is, are you thinking about driving your hip forward to extend your hip, and by default your back extends? That's how we determine it as a hip extension exercise, a hip extension dominant movement, and the back extension is simply happens on the back end of hip extension. Follow? Or is it the other way around? Where are you trying to stand the weight up and the movement becomes much more back dominant, so it becomes this back extension exercise and the hips simply follow through like that. We don't want to perform our deadlifts the latter with that back extension dominance, mainly because it overplays what the back does from an involvement standpoint and undervalues what the legs and hips do. It's not explicitly wrong to load your back in your deadlifting. You need to, you want to utilize your back as much as you can, but, this is a big but, we need to make sure that we're loading your legs and hips as much as we can and making sure your back does second to that. Although we want your back doing a lot, it needs to play a secondary, supporting, supplementary role to the priority we're trying to place in our lower half. One, because the muscles of our lower half are much bigger, the structures of the hips and knees are much stronger, and we want to protect your spine. It's much more precarious in your back. So for those reasons, we want to make sure that we're loading our legs as much as possible and our back, although doing a large amount, not as much as our legs. It's very easy to misinterpret the deadlift, Romanian deadlift or conventional deadlift, as a pulling up action, because we are quite literally pulling up from the floor, or even with a Romanian deadlift, starting from the top and then going down and then bringing the back up again. It's very easy to misinterpret where your intention should be laid, to drive it up, pull it up and stand up, which is very back dominant, the legs are undervalued, versus understanding how we should be prioritizing the hip to extend and the load placed in the back, so that up action simply happens second fiddle as a default, as a support to support what's going on at the hips. The easiest way in which to train yourself to get it right is to use a band. Now, I've laid all these out to show you which to use and which not to use. Now, the addition of the band isn't there to create extra resistance in order to make the movement more challenging. It's there to prompt you, to prompt your hips, to give you some tactile cueing as to drive your hips forward rather than pull your back up. So we want to discount the guys on the ends. This guy being a little bit too light, not really going to provide enough resistance. And this guy probably providing too much. Now, we don't want to make it too challenging, so we don't want a band which is too thick. I recommend starting with this guy. Now, the colors differ from brand to brand, but this one is about a thumb length wide, assuming your thumb is pretty conventional in width. And this guy is a little bit wider than that. I recommend starting with this, and if and when you want to try and test yourself a little bit more, you can use this one. But again, we're not trying to use the resistance of the band to create too much extra work to do through the hips. It's simply a prompt to teach your hips what the fuck to do, so you don't need this for too long. Training wheels type thing. Get rid of it, and then you've taught your body how to utilize your hips properly. You load your legs better, and your upper back only does as much as it needs to support what's going on in your lower half. So find yourself a heavy, sturdy object like this. Wrap the band around like so. We want it about waist height, obviously, because that's where it's going to go. I'm going to step inside. We want the band to sit in your hip crease. So your hip crease is where your thigh meets your torso. So lift your leg up and you'll feel it. Yep, happy days. Step forward. Don't want to step too far forward and bring this thing down with me. So I'll bring this to here. And again, we don't want to step too far forward because it's just not necessary. The same reason why we don't use a band which is too heavy because there's more resistance than we need. We don't want to step too far forward because that'll create more resistance than what's necessary, and you're going to have a harder time just finding balance, and the benefit of what we're doing here will be lost. So step as far forward as you can feel. You get pulled back if you stepped any further forward, okay? So that's gonna be our gauge. Step forward to the point where if I step any further forward, I feel like the band's gonna pull me back a little bit too much, okay? So subjectively gauge that for yourself, whether you're doing with a barbell, whether it be Romanian deadlift, conventional deadlift, maybe some dumbbells for the Romanian deadlift, doesn't really matter. We're just teaching you how to use your hips better and not your back. So I'll demonstrate first with the Romanian deadlift. I'll let the band pull my hips back, and then as I start to lift my chest and drive my hips through, I need to drive against the resistance of the band versus any sort of vertical action, which is emphasizing pulling up too much. If I don't use the resistance of the band, don't work against it rather, it's gonna pull me backwards like that. And what you'll feel is that as you drive your hip forward into extension, because you're stretching the band further, the tension on the band increases, so it prompts you to work harder as you go through the range of motion, which helps reinforce and solidifies that emphasis to use your hips, and even further goes to underplay what happens at the back. Because if you go to try and stand up like this, your hips are getting pulled back. Oh, that's where I need to go. These are just a couple of lifts in which we can improve your technique and the safety of that technique like that. Now imagine what you can do, what kind of results you can achieve if we do that, we apply that same finesse, that same improvement across all the exercises you perform and put them all together in a very comprehensive program. That's exactly what Apex Strength School is. I've created Apex Strength School as a completely comprehensive training course and program that'll teach you how to become more competent, confident, and completely self-sufficient in the gym in just 6 weeks. Don't miss the fuck out. Hit the link below this video and I'll see you at Strength School.